Welcome, folks. It's lovely to see some of you start trickling in. We're going to get started here in just a moment. I'm right across the bridge from many of you in Oakland, California, so I know that we can be a little flexible with time occasionally. If you feel so inclined, I welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat to your colleagues, to your peers, to me. I'll go ahead and get us started. So my name is Kim. My pronouns are she and hers, and I'll be joining you today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is our topic of conversation for the day, Asian Americans Building Anti-Racism. Thanks for coming to this webinar. Really hoping to have a vibrant conversation, a nuanced and complex conversation. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Kim. And welcome, everyone. My name is Peter Weber, and my pronouns are he, him. On behalf of my co-chair, Darlene Mergolano, and the APASA leadership team, I would like to wish everyone a happy AAPI Heritage Month. Thank you for joining today's kickoff event, Asian Americans Building Anti-Racism with Dr. Kim Tran. I'd like to thank the following sponsors for generously supporting today's event. The Office of the Diversity and Outreach, Asian American Research Center on Health, Benioff Children's Hospital, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Anti-Racism Council, the UCSF AAPI Coalition, San Francisco community members Marina Liu and Verstan Choi, and an anonymous donation from an AAPI UCSF faculty. Without their support, today's event would not be possible. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Kim Tran with us. Dr. Tran is a consultant and writer who brings grassroots organizing and transformative justice approaches to the workplace. For over a decade, she has supported organizations in aligning their external work and internal values. Her work has been featured in NPR, Slate, and the New York Times. Last year, Dr. Tran presented a webinar titled Unlearning Anti-Blackness in AAPI Communities, which was well attended and has had over 7,100 views on the ODO's YouTube channel. We're happy to have her back today to learn ways that we can engage in anti-racism work in our communities. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kim Tran.
Thank you so much, Peter. This is the point at which I blush really furiously. So I'm always really bowled over by folks who are engaging with my work. And I really appreciated the conversation we had last year. I'm thrilled to be back talking about a slightly different, I think, political climate. And I know a lot of us are reeling from what's happened in the last even 24 hours. So hoping that we can create space here for anything and everything that comes up in this conversation. Let's get started. We're talking about Asian Americans building anti-racism today, which is something that is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. And for those of you who don't know me, who I haven't gotten the chance to meet before, I'm going to do a little bit of a more substantive introduction to myself and how I come to this topic. I have been doing exactly this, working with organizations like yourself on equity internally for about 14 years. I was born and raised in the Bay Area, so the work that UCSF does is really close to my heart. I cut my teeth in working actually with clinical care providers. Early on in my career, I was one of a handful of people who helped build a program in the South Bay area called the LGBTQ Youth Space, and we were a mental health care program for queer and trans youth. That means that I come to this work from a really diverse kind of vantage. I think there's the direct services oriented part, the youth advocacy part of my background. There's a research part. I got my PhD from UC Berkeley in ethnic studies. So I have actually a degree in Asian American studies with a specialty in gender studies. And I also am really connected to the Asian American community in the Bay Area. So when I'm not doing my professional day job, I'm also working with Asian American organizers and community activists on what it looks like to really see racial justice for our communities. I'm writing a book on a lot of this stuff right now. It's called The End of Allyship. And I will say, as an Asian American person, that my claim to fame is one time my mom turned on the TV and saw me on MSNBC as a political pundit. She was surprised. I was surprised. I've never lived up to it since. And she has no idea why I'm not a talk show host now. So all of those fun things being said, it means that my connection to this topic is a personal one. It's a real one. I know just how hard it is to talk to our grandparents about Asian American issues, about race, about gender, about class. I know how hard it is to talk to our kids about these things, our parents. And I really want to make space for the challenge of those questions here today. So just to put in a couple of, I think, guidelines for how we engage with each other, I think the first piece is really encouraging folks to get curious about, all of the facets of your experience that you want to know a little bit more about. So those questions that we're inviting, those questions that feel a little bit tender, that you never quite knew how to answer when someone asked you. I like to joke that these are quote unquote dirty questions, and that's not what you think it means. But dirty questions are the ones that are inelegant, unfinished, undeveloped. This is a space for you to ask those questions. That being said, if you do feel a little bit shy, you can use the chat or come on live. You can also directly message your question to me, and I'll read the question out loud, but I won't attribute it to you, and we'll answer the question out loud. But again, we won't attribute it to you. Okay. Let's get started. So we wanted to have a really honest conversation about Asian Americans finding anti-racism, because it's not always an easy thing for us to do. We've got, various backgrounds in Asian American communities that may or may not lead us to doing anti-racist work. We've got our own set of beliefs and values about who we are as Asian America. And we wanted to kind of give you the opportunity to talk about these things head on. So there are a couple of kind of controversial questions that we want to ask and answer first. One of those is, what perceptions do we have, and what perceptions have we internalized about who and who is not American, and why? So when it comes to Asian America, we're talking about an extremely diverse group of people in the United States. When we say Asian American, we're actually talking about people who trace their lineage back to the Asian continent in hundreds of different countries. And they might have experiences like mine and like my family's. My family didn't come here until 1975, right? So my family is from Vietnam. I was the first generation that was born in the States. Or we might be talking about East Asian folks whose families have been here since the 1800s, building the railroads, living in places like San Francisco's Chinatown. I think irrespective of our backgrounds, we have this perception that Asian Americans are foreigners or perpetual outsiders to America. There's this understanding that white and Black folks belong in America and that Asian Americans are outside of that, right? And then even within our own racial group, we do sometimes a little bit of gatekeeping when we talk about who is Asian American and who is not. So our immediate kind of thought of who's Asian American is a little bit more arced toward East Asian folks. That's who we think of, right? So even in our popular media representations, folks like to think of Fresh Off the Boat, which is about an East Asian family, or Crazy Rich Asians, also about an East Asian family. We're seeing also the kind of Marvel universe start to introduce Asian American heroes, many of whom are, again, East Asian. And that creates a very specific understanding of our community, because we see the biggest racial wealth gap within Asian America as well. So we're not talking just about one group of folks who tend to be like the experience of Crazy Rich Asians. We're also talking about Southeast Asian folks, Nepali folks, Cambodian, Laotian, Thai folks who run kind of the gamut when it comes to their economic, financial, and class experience. So there's all of those demographic realities. And then there's the reality of what we think about ourselves and who we think is Asian American and who isn't. And that's when we start getting into these kind of more tender places, right? Around things like, are mixed race Asians Asian American? Are they Asian enough? If you are second generation, are you Asian enough? And that's when we start seeing our community fray a little bit and gatekeep. And we want to be really attentive to the reality that even people whose experiences are different, if you're like second or third generation, that is also a part of the Asian American experience, right? Even if you are mixed race Asian, you are Asian enough. That is a really important part of our community. So we have all of these perceptions and these ideas about who is not Asian and who is not Asian American. And that can kind of undermine the work that we do. I've got some comments in the chat that I want to be attentive to in this moment. So folks are agreeing that they've struggled with Vietnamese people questioning if you're Vietnamese enough because you're mixed. And that can be a really toxic idea because it undermines the sense of, I have a cultural foundation in my upbringing. I have a really strong sense of who I am. None of that changes depending on the body that I live in, right? That's kind of an advantage, a value add if we toggle more cultures. It's just as valuable as if we're born into a monoracial family. Josephine, that's such an interesting comment that you're making about addressing the sense of enough or it being blood quantum. Blood quantum is a set of policies that we saw predominantly applied to Indigenous folks. In order to be considered Indigenous or Native in America, you had to have enough blood, right? Which is a really, really problematic idea. The way that you see things like biological determinations of who and who isn't in a racial category based on things like blood. On the other side of the spectrum, you'll see Black folks who would be considered Black if they just had one drop. It's called the one drop rule of Black blood in their bodies. And I think that is a really good example of why we want to do away with this idea of, are you Asian enough? Are you Black enough? Are you Indigenous enough? Right? Because it actually, again, protects this idea of white supremacy and who has power and who doesn't, and who dictates why we have to talk about things like blood quantum or a one drop rule, right? I'm going to open us up to any questions or comments that folks might have. Any questions that you want to ask, any elaborations you want me to make, or clarification points. Please feel free to come on live. I'd love to hear a live question. So just keep an eye on the chat if you want to ask anything about what we've just spoken about. Okay. I always think it's interesting when folks share validation or affirmation, like, thank you for saying that, because it means that those are questions that they have been asked before. Those are things that they've heard in their experience, right? And the other thing that's alongside that is the incredible kind of pain that comes with being questioned in your identity in that way, right? And that kind of pain can manifest in a lot of different ways, because we don't just carry one race or ethnicity, we carry a lot of different ways that we identify. So for me, as a Vietnamese person, but also as a queer woman, I hear a lot of, are you queer enough? Or on the flip side, because I've been in a relationship with someone who is not a cisgender man for a long time, just this understanding that, like, I'm not bi anymore, or I'm not queer anymore, I'm, something else. And that really tells me a lot about the person saying it and a lot less about my own sense of my culture and my identity. We've got a couple questions in the chat that I'm really excited to talk about. Someone asking where I was born, also where you are born that is not of your motherland, or if you speak the language or not. Ooh, these are really good examples of gatekeeping and the ways in which we can really, really be exclusionary in our language. So whether or not you speak, your family's original language, whether or not you were born in that place, making you more or less Vietnamese or more or less Asian. I'll share a quick story with you that when I was in Vietnam, I was with my mom and I was having dinner with my family. And one of the servers, young Vietnamese woman, came up to me and said, you know, where are you from? And my mom told her I was from California. I was born in California, but my mom was from Northern Vietnam. And the person responded, oh, I thought she was Vietnamese. And up until that point, she had not questioned my identity in any way, shape, or form. She thought I was actually going to say I was from Northern Vietnam, like my mom. And that was really painful for me, right? Because I am really connected to my identity and to my community. But when folks undermine you in that way, they create a barrier or a wall between you. And that makes the possibility of a relationship and building a relationship. And relationships are really important in the work that we do for equity. It undermines that. And so we want to be really attentive to why we say things like that and where they come from, right? Another couple of comments here. One saying, my family is East Asian, but born in Southeast Asia. Our family speaks two dialectics of Chinese, Burmese, and English. With this hybrid upbringing, it's always been hard to feel like I truly belong to any group. That's really hard. And that's really unfortunate. I hear that a lot from folks who are mixed ethnicity, mixed racially. And I just want to say that you belong to each and every one of those groups 100%, right? I'm not a big fan of saying when folks tell me they're half Asian, like 50% Asian and 50% this other thing. You are wholly Asian. You are wholly whatever your other racial identities and groups are, right? You are complete members of your community. Seeing another few pieces in the chat here. There are African Americans who migrated to the US who may feel like outsiders too. Can you tell us more about this? So there is absolutely a reality to a division between folks in the African diaspora. Maybe you came here from Nigeria, maybe you came here from a different part of the African continent. And then a split between those folks and who are the descendants of slaves in the United States, right? So if you are an African descendant of slaves or you're an American descendant of slaves, that can be a division in the Black and African American communities. It's slightly different from how this functions within Asian American communities who are not mixed race Black. And I will say that you can see some of the edges of things like class distinctions, like Black Americans live in a different class categorization. And then there's a slight positioning of inferiority and superiority based on migration status and based on class background and experience with formal education. And that is just honestly a form of anti-Blackness that we see in America, right? There is this really disappointing reality that Black Americans are subject to a really specific form of racism. And it has to do a lot with class. It has to do a lot with colorism, how dark or light you are. It has to do a lot with, whether or not we value folks who were historically ancestors of those who were enslaved. And it's a problem, right? It's definitely a problem. I think whenever you have a group that's positioning itself as better, more, that's when we see some of our work as anti-racist start to be undermined. Right. Thanks for that question. Another couple questions here. One of them is, you hear all the time that, well, you only speak Spanglish and your Spanish isn't super fluent, so you're not really Mexican. Again, a really challenging form of gatekeeping, because the reason that we often don't speak the language of our parents is because of white supremacy, right? Maybe our parents didn't want us to struggle, so they did not encourage us to speak their language. I've worked with young people who don't even know how to pronounce their last name because their parents were so afraid of them having an accent because their parents had been discriminated against based on their accent, right? And so again, these things come from places of rootedness in white supremacy and in racism. And it's really hard for us to actually just refract that back and be exclusionary toward our own communities, right? Peter's got a great question here. How do we approach anti-racism work in the Asian American community when many in our community hold racial biases, for example, approaching family members with these biases. I think a great place to start, and a place I begin and a place I end, is with a bunch of curiosity. Your grandmother, your parents, your siblings are not going to love if you start with "that's a bad belief" or "what an embarrassing belief to have." They are really going to respond if you start with, "Hey, that I'm curious about why you believe that. What life experiences have you had that make you think that? And you should know that, I feel like when I hear you say that, it sounds like you don't want to include me or people of that kind, or people who identify that way in our community. And they're really important to me because I love a lot of folks who are within that, or members of that community, or I myself am a member of that community." Right. And so approaching with curiosity, approaching with questions, ensuring that you've got the patience and the wherewithal to have an ongoing conversation. All of these are really important ways to approach a challenging discussion, right? Know that it's not going to be done in one conversation. Know that it's not going to be done in two. These are people who you really love, whose beliefs and values you want to reflect belonging for everyone. So approach without shame, approach without a sense of punishment, make sure you're in the right place for that conversation, and expect to have it again. Right? Another comment from someone in the chat: "My family, parents, siblings, and extended relatives are Vietnam War refugees. I was the only child born within the US. My parents lost their oldest son in the war. Sorry to hear that. For a long time, my parents identified as ethnic Chinese, were mixed. It took 20 years for them to identify as more culturally Vietnamese. There was and is so much pain related to escaping the war and identifying as Vietnamese. I was the, quote, most American in my family and needed them to acknowledge the part of us that are Vietnamese. The intergenerational trauma is real." There's so much here. So one, as someone who comes from a family of folks who fled that war as well, I will say this is something that tends to go unaddressed in our communities. It's a pretty silent thing. It's a challenging thing. And we tend to not talk about it. And that's really tough, right? Because if we don't talk about it, we can't address the reality of intergenerational trauma. So studies show that intergenerational trauma lasts for at least 3 generations. It actually changes your physical makeup. And for those of us who come from families who have survived war and who have survived really traumatic things, it's important for us to know that there's work ahead around that. And it's not just about our identities, but it's also about what it means to ensure that our communities are resourced and that we're supporting and moving toward anti-racism. And a part of that is going to be healing, right? I see a couple of more affirmations and in the chat. Thank you for bringing up pronunciation of last names. Growing up, I always questioned why various family members pronounced our last name differently. Yeah, you'll see that a lot. So depending on who I'm talking to, I just had a client and actually someone who was also a clinical care provider. Her name was Maylin, but she was calling herself Mylin for people because she anglicized her name. And we have different feelings about that. That can be another kind of slightly controversial topic, right? Sometimes we anglicize our names again because people don't know how to pronounce them. We're tired of hearing them pronounced incorrectly. And that's definitely a choice that folks make. I want to validate that choice, and it comes from a real place. The other side is I think it can be a joy to hear our names pronounced properly. I love saying Win properly. It's one of my favorite activities. We've got a couple of questions here. One, my question is 2 parts. First part, I come from a melting pot state where minorities are the majority. And 2, internally, as a Filipino American or Philam, we are finding ourselves not truly pegged as Asian, but Southeast Asian. For the most part, I've assimilated well in that environment, but coming to California, it's different and taken aback on how we are received. Do we simply need to adapt to where we live? So a couple of things here. One, California is unique in the sense that there are really big Asian American communities here. So this is one of the places where you've got kind of like the highest number of Asian Americans. And so there is actually a little bit more of an ethnicity specificity that is within California, right? There's like a little Manila in California. There's a little Saigon. There are a couple of Chinatowns. There's a little Tokyo. One of the only little Tokyos left in the country of the three is here in California. And so we can get a little bit more specific with our ethnicity. And again, just because it exists doesn't mean that you have to do anything differently if that's not who you are and that doesn't feel authentic or sincere to you. I think the idea behind thinking about Asian America is also, who are we as a community? Our beliefs are going to be diverse, right? So for me, I'm very strongly connected to the reality that I'm Southeast Asian, because in terms of my class background, in terms of my language background, I do not have the same experience as Taiwanese Americans or Chinese Americans a lot of the time. Our pay gap in Asian American community, again, is the most significant pay gap of any racial community. And so I believe that is an important facet of my identity. You might not, and that's okay. And that's totally okay, right? I'm not here to gatekeep myself. So I'm not telling you to adapt just because, I believe the thing that I believe. I will say that there are ways that we want you to be able to celebrate who you are and whatever that may mean for you. And here we've got a really vibrant Filipino American community, and that's available and accessible to folks. And it will take some adjustment to the kind of cultural climate in which we exist here in California. But there's always an option in, right? There's always an option in. Another question that we see is, as an Asian manager born in America, I tend to not hire Asians with a strong accent, as I feel it looks negatively toward me. Am I the a-hole or am I the asshole? This is a tough one. So studies show that folks with non-Western accents are often penalized for competence in the workplace. Again, I don't abide by shame or blame, so I'm not gonna call you the a-hole or not, but I will say that this is something that we see over and over again, and it does have serious repercussions. And the repercussions are you're missing out on qualified folks who bring a lot to their jobs, and two, again, reproducing that kind of white supremacist, racist understanding that if you don't speak perfectly Western English, that you can't do a job well. So I'll let you make that decision whether or not you want to participate in that cycle, which has harmed all of us as Asian Americans and all of us as people of color, or not. I think this is a really good example of a self-reflective question, and I applaud you for that. I give you a lot of credit for thinking about it critically. And I hope you continue to think about it critically, especially when you approach hiring, right? What am I missing out on is the calculus that I want you to start thinking that you can make. Who might I be devaluing and why? And is that the kind of way that I want to approach this work? There's also a real potential of being structurally pushed back on at your organization for making this move, because it is not an inclusive move and it could potentially be called discrimination, right? A form of discrimination. Another question in this chat is, I think I may have misunderstood the title of this discussion as I thought it was a discussion of anti-Asian racism. I'll ask my same question because I think it's relevant. Do you think Asian Americans are currently enduring their own civil rights crisis? Yes and no. We in the Bay Area have seen a serious rise in incidents of anti-Asian violence. And that is absolutely a part of what we're talking about today. There's been a 1900% increase in folks reporting anti-Asian violence in New York to the NYPD. There have been about 4,000 incidents of anti-Asian violence that Stop AAPI Hate has found in the last couple of years since 2020. These are related topics, and Asian Americans finding anti-racism is 100% related to Asian Americans experiencing anti-Asian violence. These two things have the same kind of commitment as a requirement, right? We have to be committed to anti-racism. So there's no scarcity of racism. There's no scarcity of suffering. We're going to suffer. And we also want to get involved in building anti-racism. And a part of that work is going to be unlearning some of the things that have made us not see the people who we're building allyship and solidarity with, right? So are we currently enduring a civil rights crisis? I would say we're currently seeing the logical extension of centuries worth of anti-Asian violence and exclusion at a legislative level. So Chinese people and Chinese women were the first ever to be excluded from entering America based on their nationality and ethnicity. And that was for really racist reasons. They thought we brought disease. They thought we were sex workers as a community. And that has really stayed with us. You'll see that kind of narrative over and over again in American laws. A lot of folks talk about the model minority myth as something that has been, a really challenging stereotype to uproot. And the model minority myth, in large part, what we see is the consequence of racial terror, right? In large part, the model minority myth was meant to protect Japanese Americans and Asian folks against ever being interned again or incarcerated again because of their race. And also, we have this idea that we don't experience racism because we're the model minority, and that's just not true. We have continually experienced racism as a community. Whether or not we have acknowledged it is different, right? And whether or not we're having a conversation and have firsthand experience with it is different, because anti-Asian violence isn't happening to everyone in all the same way. It's actually happening predominantly to women. It's predominantly happening to low-income folks in ethnic hubs. It's happening to our elders, those who are the most disempowered a lot of the time, structurally and systemically. So are we in a crisis? Again, yes and no. I know that's a really academic answer. So let's talk about a couple of other things that we see in our community. And I think this is to also Eugene's question, why do we imagine that certain forms of racism are worse than others? I'll be honest and say, I think for a lot of folks that the last few years took them by surprise, that the increase in anti-Asian violence felt really sudden and marked. And for others, it really didn't. And I think there are reasons for that. Eugene, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. So for people who didn't hear, I was the guy who asked about whether Asian Americans are having a civil rights crisis right now. And thank you for addressing that. Thank you for taking my question. In preparation for this talk, I did watch your YouTube video. I thought it was very interesting. The reason I asked this question is not, it certainly involves the level of crime that we're seeing, that we've seen recently. But I think most Asian Americans, certainly in this area, know that this is not anything new. It's grown quite a bit in the last few years, but this has been going on for decades. And it's not so much the perception or the actual crimes that are being committed against Asians, but it's how this is being treated by local and federal governments, by politicians, civic leaders, academics. And so it's this multi-pronged, as I see it at least, it's this multi-pronged effort to diminish the civil rights of Asians. So aside from the crime, I was wondering, does the treatment of the crime reflect any civil rights crisis?
I don't think I quite understand your question. What are you seeing as like a systemic, concerted, intentional effort to undermine Asian American rights?
Sure.
And, yeah, can you say a little bit more?
Well, for example, everyone kind of skirts around calling the anti-Asian crime, calling it what it really seems to be, especially in this area, and what the data supports, and trying to get access to that data. Well, I mean, you can't get access to that data, and data that supports it on a national level. You can't really get access to that data either. Okay. No politicians are willing to, it's, you know, this third rail that no politician is willing to touch, irrespective of whether they're Asian or not. No politician is willing to touch this. And it feels like the needs of Asians are being overlooked.
Yeah, okay. I get a sense of your question now, and thank you for asking the question. So a couple of things. Do y'all remember the shooting in Atlanta? Do you know what I'm talking about, Eugene? Do you remember the shooting in Atlanta at the massage parlor? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So following that shooting, the police chief had come out and said this was not racially motivated. And I think everybody knew otherwise, right? So one of the things we want to keep in mind is that in the United States, we have tied racist systems to racist intentions and racist people. And that's not how racism works, right? So this is something that we'll see again and again in other communities of color. They've been struggling with this for a long time, like whether or not the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson was racially motivated, whether or not the reality that 60% of people who are incarcerated are Black or Latinx has anything to do with race. We know in terms of approaching racism as a reality systemically, that you can't look at race whether or not it's just intentional, right? And that's the problem that I think Asian Americans are also coming up against, that folks are not necessarily recognizing this as anti-Asian violence, because at a national level, that is not how the law tends to work. You have to have racist intent. And so what we have is a real obvious failure to reckon with the reality that we don't live our lives in a racially neutral way. People, if you present as an Asian American, people are going to treat you as an Asian American person, right? If you present as a Black person, people are going to treat you in that way in accordance with your presentation. And so that's the reality that I think we're seeing there's a gap there, is that we live these lives that we know are patterned by the bodies in which we exist. But the law doesn't exist that way. The law is supposedly equality-based, it's flat. It does not recognize race. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure the application to what I said. I'm not sure I fully understand that. You're saying that the law prevents people from recognizing what we're all seeing in the news every day?
And so you're talking about, I think, why aren't politicians talking about it? And is that, I thought that was your question, that politicians aren't really talking about it. No one's really doing anything about it. People are not saying that what we're experiencing is an obvious, serious rise in anti-Asian violence or the fraying of Asian American rights. And I'm saying it absolutely is, but the failure to deal with that is actually a more widespread failure amongst communities of color. Right.
Well, I definitely agree with that, the last comment. But to your point, when the law, as I said, I think part of the problem is, you know, your point about legislation. It's guiding us away from the truth. And when politicians don't recognize it, when the popular media doesn't recognize it, it really seems to diminish I've always felt that Asians are kind of the invisible. I know this isn't an original idea, but sort of an invisible race. And even at UCSF, I think there are examples of this, and it's very frustrating. I think I wonder what society's response would be if what we see going on in the Bay Area, if the races were swapped.
What do you
Whether
mean?
There would be more of a public outcry if that were the case.
Got it. So I hear a couple of things. One, you are not the first to say that Asian Americans are the invisible, what they call the invisible minority, right? And that is largely because we have patterned racism in America to only belong to one group of people, and that's Black Americans, because we exist in what's called a racial binary, right? So what we see within a racial binary is white folks perpetrate racism to Black folks, end of story. And then it becomes incumbent upon Black folks to fight against that oppression. And nobody else is included in that racial binary. So that racism belongs to this one group, and then fighting for racial justice also belongs to this one group.
Absolutely.
That is what it means to exist in a racial binary. The problem with that is obviously that suddenly when you have a serious rise in anti-Asian violence against Asian Americans, no one is ready to deal with it. Because for so long, we thought that Asian Americans were politically quiet, that we didn't experience any sort of racism in large part because we were model minorities, and that it wasn't a problem, when it continued to be a problem for centuries, right? But that's not a part of what we call the national imaginary or the American imaginary. We still have this stubborn sense that the racism that Asian Americans experience is not real. It's not as bad. It's not as severe. And on the flip side of that, it doesn't feel like folks are really invested in racial justice in a multiracial way.
Well,
but go ahead.
I'm sorry. Well, I was to that last point. I think minority groups are invested in not acknowledging anti-Asian racism. I think they are trying to set up protective boundaries. You know, we're just becoming stratified. I think people are trying to set up protective boundaries. They're trying to protect what's theirs. And I say this a bit tongue in cheek, but but when you start attacking an Asian's education, that's the last line of defense. That's when Asians will start voting.
We're talking about LOL. We're talking about affirmative action. So
well, it's part of it, right? That's why I'm saying it's a civil rights crisis, because, okay, whether you agree with affirmative action or not, the end result is that Asian American admissions go down.
That is patently untrue. So I want to stop. I want to be very clear here. So a couple of things. So I want to address this, and then we've got a couple of other questions, Eugene. One, Asian Americans are largely, overwhelmingly on board with affirmative action if we discuss it in the right way. If we discuss affirmative action as a measure which improves the lives of folks who have been systemically disadvantaged and to whom the system has been unfair, then absolutely, Asian Americans are on board with affirmative action. I want to be very clear again that Asian Americans have the largest racial wealth gap. So you will have Southeast Asians, people like me. Vietnamese women have the exact same pay gap as Black women. It's 63 cents to the dollar. So Asian Americans are not a monolith. We're not being hurt by affirmative action because a lot of us live lives like mine, right? And then the other side is envisioning that we are divided from other communities of color is extremely challenging on getting us to a place where we are fighting anti-racism in a way that will advantage all communities of color, right? So I think that I understand where your comment is coming from, and I just want us to broaden our perspective to include the reality of, for instance, 500,000 undocumented Asians in California, broaden our reality to the fact that Chinese Americans are some of the poorest members of our community who would absolutely be advantaged by affirmative action, but that frequently this conversation becomes driven by this strange thought that when we talk about Asian America, we're only talking about a specific group of people who is advantaged in a lot of social ways that not all of us are. So I want to thank you, Eugene, for your question. We've got like 10 other questions in only 15 minutes. So please feel free to reach out afterward as we answer some of these other ones. We've got one in the chat, and then Eileen, I'm gonna go ahead and answer your hand in a moment here. So the question in the chat was, How would you recommend opening an Asian American person's mind to anti-racism when they have been a victim of a crime by the ethnic group against which they already have a bias? Ooh, Alvin, that one's tough. And that's something I actually have experienced in my life. So a while ago, I was mugged by someone who was Black American. And I think this is also one of the realities of our communities. Like, we're very close together. We share a lot of economic ground together. And here's the reality. A lot of what happens there is confirmation bias. Right. So yes, did I experience something that was traumatizing at the hands of someone who was also a person of color, who was a Black American? Sure, absolutely. Is it the only Black American person in my life? No, I have a lot of folks in my life who would never harm me in that way, who would never harm anyone in that way, and who really care about me and cared that that happened to me. Right. So I want us to really think about broadening that out to, is this confirmation bias? In the same way that what we see on the news and what we've seen with anti-Asian violence is an over and a hyper fixation on criminalizing Black folks. Right. So what we see in the news is this, like, a bunch of anti-Asian violence that's perpetrated by Black folks. The reality is like 85 to 90% of the anti-Asian violence has been perpetrated by white people. But we're not talking about that because we're only seeing one kind of visual narrative. And I want us to be really careful about that. I want us to broaden it out a little bit and do just a little bit of research, right? Where is my next question? Sorry, folks, I'm just rifling through. We've got another one from CJ here. Go ahead, CJ, you've got your hand up. And Eileen, we lost you. So if you want to throw your question in somewhere, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. As a member of our LGBT committee and an Asian person, I'm curious about your thoughts on kind of how we can bridge together as intersectional minorities and or how we can get out of each other's way and how we're hurting each other.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that, CJ. I share, I think, your commitment, your dedication to building these bridges as a queer person. So a couple of things to remember about the Asian American community is that frequently the narrative is kind of dominated by the most advantaged people in our community. So that would be the cis people, the straight people, and how do we create a bridge to each other, I think, is plain and simply by asking who we've missed this entire time and who's not in the room, right? And frequently also asking ourselves and asking each other, why not, right? So if I look around and I notice that in my Asian American employment resource group, there are no queer and trans Asian Americans, that's a problem. And I have to ask myself about why haven't I community built with this community? And how then do I invite folks in, make sure that belonging is a key feature of what the work that we're doing. There was a study that came out very recently about Asian American queer and trans mental health. And it is, as we expected, Asian American youth and trans Asian American youth are having a very different experience of mental health in an already silenced community, right? So one of the things we want to do is plain and simply ask ourselves questions and take systemic steps to invite folks into that work and let them drive. Right. One of the realities is I think we don't actually do a bunch of work to create the kind of appropriate climate where people with intersectional identities can take up space. So if we're doing ERIG work, who's leading it and why? And if it's the same person, it's the same cisgender straight person, why is that? If it's the same able-bodied person, why is that? Is it the same person who went to Ivy League schools? Why is that? And it's incumbent upon us to change that, right? CJ, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. We've got another couple folks here in the chat.
Also in the Q&A, there's a few more questions.
Awesome, thank you. We've got one from Edgar. On another aspect, does the media help or hurt recognizing anti-racism overall in terms of how they report this uptick? I think it's hard to turn to a lot of major news sources. I think the major news sources have just now gotten wise in the last couple of years to anti-Asian violence. And while that's important, I want us to also think about Asian American resources, because the way that major news sources have this conversation is not necessarily how we're having a conversation about it on a community level, right? Especially in terms of things like policing, especially in terms of things like who's taking the mic and why, and whose voices are reflected and why. They're much kind of later in their progression. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I was invited to be on a major news outlet, and the person who was interviewing me was Chinese American, and she, we had a great conversation, and she said she'd been a broadcast journalist at a really reputable place for 15 years, and she had never, ever covered Asian American issues. And that was really frightening to me, because that's all I do. I did all my research in Asian American studies. I teach Asian American studies. So do I think that major outlets are doing a good job? Not necessarily. Do I think that there are people who are doing a great job? Absolutely. Michelle's asking what news outlets might be the best to give us a total picture of what anti-Asian violence looks like. I think turning to a local one for you all would make a lot of sense. Stop AAPI Hate over at San Francisco State is doing phenomenal work here. I think that is a really key place of thinking about critically about where we're getting our news. Okay, Gail, I love this comment. I think it's important to understand who is dividing communities of color, right? So we're getting played frequently against other communities of color. And honestly, we are losing our eye. We're losing the ball here a little bit, where we've lost the thread. The minute that we start saying Asian Americans will be harmed by a policy like affirmative action that actually improves the lives of all communities of color, we've lost kind of the thread, and the thread being that racism has hurt us all. And the way to undo racism is not by just championing what's good for us as one community. And even then, not even all of our community, because that would hurt folks like me, but thinking about what racial justice goals are and what anti-racism is as an end goal for all of us and how we really do that work, right? We've got another couple questions in the chat. I'm a manager here, always trying to learn more about others' realities and experiences. I find it troubling, though, when citations of the rise of anti-Asian violence is used as a reason to work remotely, to stay safe at home versus potential violence by commuting to work. Am I wrong? I love that there are these questions of, am I the jerk? Am I wrong? One, there was a study of Fortune 500 companies that came out, and almost everybody's going into hybrid. Hybrid work is really accessible for disabled folks. Hybrid work really cuts down on racist microaggressions. I think we really have to keep that in mind, because it's not just about anti-Asian violence, but it's about a lot of different forms of violence. So I'm just going to give you a quick Microsoft number, which is that over a lot more white folks want to come back into the office than Black folks. And the reason for that is often cited as racial microaggressions. So about 21 to 25% of white folks want to come back into the office. Only 3% of Black folks want to come back into the office. And a really big part of that is the culture of racism. Another anonymous question that we've got is, sometimes I feel that UCSF assumes API folks have not suffered enough in comparison to other minority groups. Therefore, we don't deserve support. We're expected to keep our heads down, get back to work. Even with the recent climate survey, data showed that API folks are just as satisfied in their work as white people, when in reality, the data should show that API folks are just as unsatisfied with their work environment as other people of color. We should not have to prove our suffering in order to be supported by our employer. Any advice on how to get employers to really listen to us? This is really challenging. I think that is a part of the racial binary, right? We've identified racism as it only applies to one group, and as it only is the most urgent in this one group of folks. And that's just plain and simply not true. So if I were you, I might launch a survey of Asian Americans who are experiencing intersectional forms of marginalization, and also Asian Americans specifically. And so you'll get a different kind of layout of the land. And this comment is also for us to think intersectionally overall. So for instance, if you are LGBTQ and Asian American, you're experiencing workplace discrimination at a rate of about 72%. That is extremely high. I would imagine that someone who is Asian American and queer or trans is not going to have that satisfied experience, right? And so really thinking about our intersectionally marginalized folks, people who embody a lot of different marginalized identities and not just one. Right. Okay. We've only got a couple questions or a couple moments left together. I'm trying to see if I missed any questions. I'm actually going to turn this over to Alvin. Alvin, did I miss any questions?
No, I think it was great, and
Okay.
you kind of hit majority of the questions. I don't think you've missed anything.
Awesome. I will close before handing it back. Oh, we do have another question. I'm sorry. Oh, this is an internal question about URM as a definition. The last thing I'll say is I know these conversations are tough, folks. I know having these conversations are hard. I know that us expanding who we understand as Asian American is going to require individual work. It's going to require interpersonal work in our relationships with folks. The reality is this: racism, and therefore becoming anti-racist, is something that is a job that we share. It's a collectively owned project, right? And so please consider this an invitation to anti-racist work and an invitation to really digging deep, asking yourself, what is it that I have internalized that isn't in alignment with becoming an effective anti-racist, and why? And what can I do now to push myself forward and to push this goal of equity and anti-racism forward? Right. Always around for a follow-up question. I love them. I'm going to hand them over to Alvin to close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Kim Tran. This was super exciting and a great round two. And I really, really loved all the questions, and you're awesome. And, really appreciate your expertise. And hopefully everybody here got a really good glimpse. I know it's hard to, it's not like we could solve racism in an hour, but the goal is really just to help us just to think more and really have some engaging questions, and also help us, APASA, to really see like, hey, what are some questions that are really important to our community here at UCSF? And if any, Kim, she put in her email address. So if anybody had any direct questions to ask her, that would be really great. It's in the chat. Also in the chat, I'm going to put in our address to join the listserv. So for any new upcoming events for APASA, this month is Asian Heritage Month. So this was our kickoff event, and some other things that are coming down the pipeline. For example, out-of-state virtual film screening, a fireside chat that's going to be happening on May 11th with Sierra Lacey. The mayor of Daly City, we're going to have a conversation with him on Wednesday, May 18th. We have a API trivia night on May 17th, and a lot of other great events that are coming up. So please, please, please sign up for our listserv if you're not on there already, and look out for other future events sponsored by APASA. Thank you so much for joining us today and listening to Dr. Kim Tran. Dr. Kim Tran, thank you for doing this event with us. I really appreciate it. And thank you, APASA community, for being here. You guys are really, really great. And I loved a lot of the questions and discussions today. So that concludes our event for today. Thank you again for joining. And I look forward to our next events in the future. You're getting a lot of accolades in the chat, so I think you can see that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, folks, for these questions. I know this can be a challenging conversation, so appreciate y'all getting curious with me. And thank you again to Alvin and Peter and Tiffany for bringing me in. Always love spending some time with APASA. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Take care.